You open your eyes, and in your imagination, you are seated in a hall lit by dozens of flickering candles. The room smells faintly of smoke, of damp wood, and of animal fat burning in the sconces. Before you is not a shining plate, but a rough slab of hardened bread, called a trencher, that will serve as your dish for the meal. The feast is about to begin. The medieval banquet has been portrayed in countless paintings, films, and even storybooks as a place of merriment, music, and gluttonous indulgence. Yet, if you were truly there, if you were sitting among the clatter of knives and the press of woolen cloaks, the sound of dogs barking under the tables and the smell of unwashed bodies, you would quickly realize that feasts were not merely spectacles of abundance. They were uncomfortable, unhygienic, and filled with practical details that reveal much about the society that staged them. In this first part, we will look closely at what it was like to actually sit at one of these feasts. Who attended, what the hall looked like, what the food was served on, and how the event was structured. This may sound dull, but the long-forgotten minutiae of how a meal was staged in the 13th or 14th century gives us insight into the daily priorities and anxieties of an entire civilization. The center of the medieval banquet was the Great Hall. Castles, manor houses, and even monasteries often had a large chamber that served as a multipurpose room, dining area, court, gathering space, and sometimes even sleeping quarters for servants. The Great Hall was long and narrow, with a high roof that allowed smoke from the hearth to rise upward, but rarely did it leave entirely. Instead, a haze of smoke usually lingered near the rafters, giving the room a constant grayish atmosphere. If you imagine yourself sitting here, your eyes might water as the fire crackled at one end, both warming the space and filling it with the scent of burning oak. Tables were not permanent pieces of furniture. They were usually trestle tables, long wooden planks laid across collapsible supports. At the beginning of a feast, servants would assemble them quickly, cover them with cloth if the household could afford it, and lay out the necessary items for eating. Benches or stools lined the tables. Chairs with backs were rare, often reserved for the highest-ranking individuals. The lord and lady of the house might sit on elaborate chairs placed at the high table, elevated slightly above the rest of the room. Lighting was dim. Tallow candles, made of animal fat, gave off a greasy smoke and an uneven flame. Only the wealthiest households could afford beeswax candles, which burned cleaner and brighter. This meant that for most guests, the feast was conducted in semi-darkness, with shadows dancing across the walls and rafters. Imagine, then, eating not by the clear light of day but by the wavering flame of dozens of smoky candles, each one dripping wax onto the table or the floor. Feasts were never just about eating, they were about hierarchy. Where you sat was as important as what you ate. At the high table sat the lord and his most honored guests, perhaps visiting nobles, bishops, or important retainers. These people received the finest cuts of meat and the freshest bread trenchers. They were also the most visible, seated on a dais where all could see their manners and wealth. Lower down the hall sat lesser guests, knights, officials, and local landholders. At the very bottom, near the entrance and furthest from the fire, sat servants, retainers of low status, and sometimes musicians or clerks who were invited more for their function than for their honor. The order of seating was rigid, and everyone in the room knew exactly what their place meant. Your plate, if you had one, was not porcelain or pewter, but a stale hunk of bread. The trencher was a thick slice of coarse bread, baked specifically to be firm enough to hold food without immediately crumbling. On it, servants would place meat, broth, or sauce. As the meal went on, the trencher would soak up grease and juices. When you were finished, you did not eat it, at least not usually. Instead, It was collected and either given to the poor, fed to animals, or, in some cases, eaten by the lowest-ranking guests. Knives were your main utensil. Forks were virtually unknown in most of medieval Europe until very late, and spoons were used mainly for soups or potages. Most diners used their hands for much of the meal, tearing meat apart, dipping bread into sauces, and licking their fingers clean. Napkins were not provided. Instead, people often wiped their hands on the tablecloth, on their clothing, or on the dogs that wandered freely beneath the tables. The feast began with lighter dishes, though by our standards they were still heavy. Soups, known as potages, were common, thick stews of barley, peas, onions, and whatever meat was available. Spices like pepper, cinnamon, and ginger were added not just for flavor but to demonstrate wealth, since these had to be imported across great distances. Roasted meats followed, venison, boar, swan, or goose in noble households, mutton, pork, or chicken in more modest ones. The meat was often served in large joints or whole birds, making carving a visible part of the spectacle. Imagine watching as a servant carried an entire roasted peacock to the high table, its feathers reattached to its cooked body for dramatic effect. The appearance was more impressive than the taste, which might be dry or tough depending on how long it had been kept before cooking. Alongside the meat were sauces, thickened with bread crumbs, flavored with vinegar, wine, or almonds. Bright colors were prized, so cooks sometimes added saffron or ground parsley to create yellow or green sauces. Each dish reflected a mixture of culinary creativity and the limited preservation methods of the time. What would it have felt like, sitting there? The hall was loud. Dogs barked and fought for scraps. Musicians played lutes or hurdy-gurdies between courses. Guests shouted to one another across the long tables. Servants hurried back and forth, carrying heavy trays or jugs of ale. The smell was a blend of roasted meat, spiced wine, human sweat, wet wool, and smoke. It was not an environment of quiet elegance, but of noisy, crowded, and pungent celebration. For those attending, the feast was less about taste and more about participation in a ritual. To sit in the hall was to acknowledge the Lord's generosity and to accept one's place in the order of society. Food was not simply nourishment, it was a statement of power, yet, despite the grandeur, reality was never far from the surface. The bread trenchers were sometimes days old. The meat might have been preserved with too much salt, making it unpleasantly chewy. Water was rarely served, considered unsafe, so ale or weak wine was the main drink, which meant people often grew drowsy or even drunk by the later courses. Hygiene was poor. Shared cups were common, and hand-washing before meals was done perfunctorily in basins of cold water, which were rarely changed between guests. The feast, in all its supposed splendor, was messy, greasy, and exhausting. By the time you reached the end of even the first course, your fingers would be sticky with fat, your clothes spotted with broth, and your ears ringing from the din of the hall. As you imagine sitting there, tearing at a piece of roasted mutton and glancing toward the smoky rafters above, a question lingers: was this truly a celebration of abundance, or simply a display meant to cover the less appetizing truths of medieval life? If you had walked into a medieval banquet hall at the height of the feast, you might have seen abundance everywhere, platters of meat, jugs of ale, and tables crowded with guests, yet to truly understand what these occasions meant, you have to step back from the food itself and look at the structures that supported it, the servants preparing it, the rules of behavior that shaped it, and even the medical theories that explained it. In this section, we will move away from the spectacle at the table and sink into the machinery of the feast. We'll explore who labored to make these meals possible, what rules governed the behavior of guests, and how medieval people understood food in terms of health and balance. Beneath the glamour lies an immense system of effort and belief, which gives us a much clearer view of why these feasts mattered, and why they could feel so uncomfortable for those who lived through them. For every guest seated in the great hall, there were perhaps 5 or 10 people working behind the scenes. The kitchens of a large manor or castle were complex, noisy, and often overwhelming. Fires burned hot all day, with spits turning whole animals by hand. Young boys were tasked with slowly turning the spit for hours at a time, their faces flushed from the heat and their arms sore from the repetitive motion. Other servants chopped vegetables, ground spices, and prepared sauces in large mortars. Bakers tended ovens that could produce dozens of loaves of bread, some for trenchers, others for eating. Brewers worked in advance to ensure sufficient ale, since a feast might consume hundreds of gallons. Carving meat was an art in itself. The carver, often a trusted servant, was trained to cut each portion neatly and with dignity. The way he sliced the venison or presented the fowl reflected directly on the prestige of the host. A poorly carved roast was considered shameful, not merely clumsy. Meanwhile, dishwashers had the unpleasant task of scrubbing greasy wooden platters and iron pots in cold water mixed with sand or ash. Servants ran back and forth carrying water, clearing scraps, and refilling pitchers. Many of them ate little during the event itself, snatching bits of bread or scraps of meat in the kitchen while ensuring that the hall outside remained flowing with food. The labor of these unnamed workers rarely appears in chronicles or poems celebrating a noble feast. Yet without them, the spectacle of abundance would have been impossible. If you imagine medieval diners tearing into food with their bare hands in a messy free-for-all, you would only be half correct. Yes, the feast was noisy and unhygienic by modern standards, but it was also governed by an elaborate set of rules. Medieval courtesy books, instructional guides for young nobles, are filled with advice about how to behave at table. You were instructed to wash your hands before sitting down, though the water might not have been particularly clean. You were told not to lick your fingers too loudly, to avoid blowing your nose into the tablecloth, and never to use your knife to scratch yourself. Sharing was common, but it came with expectations. 2 people often shared a trencher or a cup. This meant that politeness was necessary. You were to take small bites, avoid dipping greasy meat back into the communal sauce, and not drink so deeply that nothing remained for your partner. Guests were also advised not to lean too heavily on the table, not to talk with food in their mouths, and not to point at dishes with their knives. Burping or belching was discouraged in Northern Europe, though in some regions it may have been considered a sign of satisfaction. The rules extended to conversation as well. One should not boast too loudly, criticize the food, or argue with one's neighbors. The feast was, above all, a performance of order and hierarchy. To behave badly was to dishonor not only yourself, but also the lord who hosted the gathering. One detail often overlooked is that medieval people did not see food as mere sustenance. Instead, it was deeply tied to health through the medical theory of the 4 humors. According to this belief, the human body was composed of 4 elements: blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. Each food was thought to influence these humors, warming or cooling the body, moistening or drying it. For example, beef was considered heavy and difficult to digest, suited for laborers but not ideal for the delicate balance of noble bodies. Poultry was thought lighter and more refined. Fish was considered cooling, while red wine was warming. Spices such as ginger and cinnamon were prized not only for taste but because they were believed to counteract excessive cold or dampness. Cooks and physicians often worked together to design menus that would balance the humors of the season. In winter, warming foods were encouraged, roasted meats, spiced wines, and hearty stews. In summer, lighter dishes with cooling ingredients might be preferred. This explains why so many strange dishes appeared at feasts, foods colored artificially with saffron or parsley, meats covered in sugar, or almond milk sauces poured over fish. They were not only displays of wealth but also attempts to bring the body into harmony with nature. Despite the rules and medical theories, reality was rarely neat. Guests grew drunk as the feast went on, and etiquette slipped. Cups spilled, dogs fought over bones, and drunken singing often replaced polite conversation. The longer the evening continued, the less anyone cared about humors or manners. For the lowest-ranking attendees, servants, squires, and hired musicians, the feast was often exhausting. They might eat only what scraps remained after the higher tables were satisfied. Their experience was one of service and fatigue rather than abundance. Even for the nobles at the high table, the food could be overwhelming. Multiple courses stretched on for hours, with dishes arriving in a steady stream. A guest might eat roasted swan, followed by eel pie, followed by stewed mutton, followed by spiced pears. The sheer variety could leave one bloated and uncomfortable. Medical advice often recommended vomiting afterward to make room for the next course. When you put these details together, the endless labor of servants, the strict etiquette, the medical reasoning, and the excess, what emerges is not simply a meal but a political statement. A lord who hosted a grand feast demonstrated his ability to command resources, to provide for others, and to uphold the traditions of order. Guests left not merely with full stomachs, but with a reinforced sense of who was powerful and who was not. Yet this came at a cost. Behind the shimmering surface lay sweat, hunger, discomfort, and waste. The feast was both a marvel and a burden, a glittering spectacle that revealed, if you looked closely, the less glamorous side of medieval society. So, as you picture yourself sitting at the trestle table, sharing a greasy trencher with your neighbor, you may wonder, was the feast truly about nourishment, or was it a carefully staged illusion, one that left everyone, from lord to servant, a little more weary than fulfilled? By now, you have seen the medieval feast from two angles: the physical experience of sitting in the smoky hall with a greasy trencher before you, and the hidden labor and beliefs that made it possible. But to complete the picture, we must look at what happened when the feast ended. For while the feast began in abundance, it nearly always ended in waste, fatigue, and sometimes illness. And as centuries passed, even the custom of grand banqueting itself began to shift, slowly dissolving into something very different. When the final course had been carried in, perhaps sugared almonds, fruit preserved in honey, or cheese served with wafers, the hall was far from finished with its work. Guests leaned back, groaning from the weight of too many courses. Candles had burned down, dripping wax across the tables. The dogs beneath the benches were swollen from scraps. The trenchers, soaked through with grease and sauce, were collected. In wealthy households, these were given to the poor at the gates, though the bread was often hard and saturated with animal fat. In less charitable homes, the trenchers were fed to pigs or thrown away. The amount of food that went uneaten was staggering. Chroniclers occasionally noted banquets where dozens of dishes went untouched, created solely for the sake of display. Servants then faced the exhausting task of clearing away platters, scrubbing greasy bowls, and sweeping rushes from the floor. The hall smelled of smoke, spilled ale, and rotting scraps long after the guests had gone. Why so much food? Why such waste? The answer lies in symbolism. In an age when famine was never far away, the ability to provide excess food, food that could not possibly be consumed, was a statement of control over scarcity. A lord who could feed not only his household but also his guests and their servants, and still throw scraps to beggars, was a lord who demonstrated his wealth and power in visible terms. The waste itself was the point. To leave food uneaten was to say, I have more than enough. In some ways, the medieval feast was less about eating and more about staging a drama of plenty. The medical consequences of such feasts were predictable. Overeating was common, and physicians often warned against it. Indigestion, gout, and fevers were associated with the upper classes, whose diets leaned heavily on meat, sugar, and spiced wine. Some nobles even employed personal physicians who would advise them on what to eat during a feast. Afterward, vomiting was not uncommon. In fact, some etiquette manuals subtly suggested that it was better to excuse oneself discreetly than to sit through the later courses in visible discomfort. The poorer guests, who may not have had regular access to rich food, could become ill simply from the sudden change in diet. To gorge on heavily spiced meats and strong drink after a life of porridge and ale was a shock to the body that as the Middle Ages wore on, the feast itself began to change. By the late 15th century, the Great Hall was no longer the sole stage for dining. Nobles began to build smaller, private dining chambers, seeking intimacy and refinement rather than sheer scale. The Renaissance brought new ideas of civility, greater concern for table manners, and more refined utensils. Forks, once exotic, began to appear at European tables. Food presentation became more artful, with sugar sculptures and elaborate centerpieces replacing the crude spectacle of whole roasted animals. The medieval feast, with its smoky halls, trenchers, and roaring fires, slowly faded into memory. It was replaced by a different form of dining, still excessive, still symbolic, but less communal and more concerned with elegance. Looking back, the feast appears less as a joyful celebration and more as a mirror of medieval society itself. Every element reflected the world outside the hall. Hierarchy, who sat where, who ate what, and who served whom, all reinforced social order. Labor, the endless work of servants, cooks, and brewers was hidden behind the glitter of abundance. Belief, food was tied to health, morality, and even cosmic balance through the theory of the four humors. Power, the waste and excess displayed the Lord's wealth, even at the cost of discomfort or sickness. It was, in the end, a ritual of control, control over resources, over people, and over appearances. Imagine again that you are seated in the smoky hall, your trencher soggy with grease, your stomach uncomfortably full, the dogs nosing at your feet. The Lord at the high table smiles, his guests laughing loudly over cups of spiced wine. But behind the laughter you sense exhaustion, the cooks in the kitchen scraping pots, the servants staggering under the weight of trays, the poor at the gates chewing on greasy bread. What lingers in your mind is not the taste of the food, but the meaning of the act. The feast was not designed for comfort, nor for pleasure. It was designed to remind everyone present of their place in the order of things. And so the question remains, when we strip away the spectacle, was the medieval feast truly a celebration, or was it a reminder of just how little joy abundance can bring when it is built upon hunger, labor, and waste? You lift a wooden cup to your lips. Inside is not crystal clear water, nor a fizzy soft drink, nor even fresh milk. Instead, you taste something cloudy, slightly sour, and faintly warm. This is ale, the staple drink of much of medieval Europe, consumed by peasants and nobles alike. If the medieval feast seemed greasy and unrefined, the drinks that accompanied it were no better. In fact, they were often stranger, more unsettling, and far less reliable. To understand how people lived and survived in the Middle Ages, you have to understand what they drank, why they drank it, and how it was prepared. In this section, we will look closely at the everyday drinks of medieval Europe, ale, wine, water, and the occasional alternatives that made their way into the cup. Begin, consider water. Today, it seems obvious that the simplest drink in the world would be fresh water. But in the Middle Ages, water was not usually trusted. Rivers, ponds, and wells were often polluted, filled with animal waste, household refuse, or the runoff from fields. Without modern understanding of bacteria, people still recognized that water could make them sick. That did not mean no one drank it. Peasants in the countryside drank from wells and springs, especially when no alternatives were available. Monks in cloisters drank water during times of fasting. But in towns and at feasts, water was considered unsafe, impure, and even unfitting for people of high status. Instead, fermentation became the solution. By brewing grains or fermenting grapes, medieval people created drinks that were not only safer to consume but also carried cultural and social weight. Ale was the backbone of daily life in much of northern Europe. Brewed from barley or oats, it was thick, low in alcohol, and consumed by everyone, men, women, children, peasants, and nobles. It provided calories as well as hydration, making it an essential part of survival. But ale was not the golden, bubbly beer you might imagine today. It was cloudy, unfiltered, and often spoiled quickly. Brewers did not have hops in early centuries, so the drink lacked the bitter preservative that later defined beer. Instead, herbs like groot, a mixture of yarrow, bog myrtle, and rosemary, were sometimes added to flavor and preserve it. The result was uneven. One batch might taste decent, another might be sour, gritty, or even slimy. Since ale had to be drunk quickly before it went bad, it was brewed constantly. Most households, especially in villages, brewed their own. Women were often the primary brewers, known as alewives, selling small quantities to neighbors or providing drink for their own families. Imagine sipping from a wooden cup filled with lukewarm, slightly thick ale. There is no fizz, no chilled freshness, just a grainy liquid with a faint sweetness. It fills your stomach like porridge in liquid form. This was not a luxury, it was daily life. Further south, in regions like France, Spain, and Italy, wine dominated. Where grapes grew, wine was the preferred drink, and it carried prestige far beyond its taste. To drink wine was to associate oneself with refinement, learning, and even spiritual purity. Yet medieval wine was not like the bottles you might find on a modern shelf. It was often sour, heavily spiced, or mixed with water. Preservation was difficult, so wine spoiled quickly. To mask the taste, people added honey, cinnamon, ginger, or cloves. Some wines were boiled down into syrups called sapa or defrutum, used as sweeteners. Others were turned into mulled wine, heated with spices to create a warming, medicinal drink. At feasts, wine was a marker of class. Nobles drank imported varieties from distant vineyards, while poorer people consumed whatever local grapes could provide. To serve wine at all was a sign of wealth, since transport and storage required resources. A lord who poured generous cups of wine for his guests was demonstrating both prosperity and cultural sophistication. Not all ale or wine was equally strong. Brewing methods varied, producing drinks of different potency. Weak ale, sometimes called small ale, contained very little alcohol and was safe enough for children. Stronger brews were saved for celebrations, feasts, and moments of prestige. The line between drink and food was blurred. Thick alesh, rich with grain, could be almost like a meal in themselves. Sweetened wines were prescribed by physicians as remedies for illness. Even water mixed with a little alcohol, to cleanse it, was common. While ale and wine dominated, other drinks existed at the margins. Mead, made from fermented honey, was rare but prized, associated with ancient traditions and special occasions. Cider appeared in some apple-growing regions, though it was less widespread in the early Middle Ages. Milk was consumed, but usually fresh from the animal and rarely stored. It soured quickly and was often turned into cheese or butter instead of drunk as a beverage. Herbal infusions also existed, though they were usually considered medicinal rather than recreational. A monk might brew a tisane of mint, fennel, or chamomile to ease stomach pain. But these were not the daily drinks of the medieval masses. Drinks in the Middle Ages were never just about thirst. They were about community and belonging. Alehouses served as gathering points in villages, where neighbors exchanged news and gossip over cloudy mugs of homebrew. Monasteries brewed their own beer, not just for monks but for pilgrims and travelers seeking hospitality. At the Lord's table, the act of pouring wine for a guest was itself a statement of generosity. To refuse a drink could be seen as an insult, to share a cup was to seal trust. Even the weakest ale was a thread binding people together. If you were transported back to a medieval feast and handed a drink, you might recoil at the flavor. Your ale would be flat, heavy, and faintly sour. Your wine might be spiced, gritty, or overly sweetened with honey. Water would be avoided unless you were desperate. Every sip carried the memory of fermentation, spoilage, or herbs used to disguise bad taste. And yet, for medieval people, these were the flavors of daily life. They did not expect crisp clarity or sparkling freshness. Instead, they sought safety, sustenance, and social meaning in their cups. As you lower your wooden mug, you may wonder, in a world where water itself was mistrusted, did medieval people truly enjoy their drinks, or did they simply endure them as another necessity of survival? If in section 1 you imagined yourself tasting the cloudy ale or spiced wine of the Middle Ages, then in this section you will step back into the world where those drinks were made, sold, and consumed. Behind every mug of ale or cup of wine was a chain of labor, law, and social custom that kept the medieval world drinking steadily from morning until night. The culture of drink was not just about thirst. It was about how households survived, how communities gathered, and how lords and towns regulated behavior. By looking closely at the world of brewing, taverns, and drunkenness, we can see how alcohol was both a comfort and a danger in daily life. For many medieval households, especially in villages, brewing was as essential as baking bread. Women were usually responsible for it, and they brewed not in great casks for trade but in small batches for immediate use. Ale spoiled quickly without hops, often within 2 or 3 days, so brewing was a constant rhythm of life. The process was simple but labor-intensive. Grains, barley, oats, or rye, were soaked, sprouted, dried, and then mashed in hot water. The resulting liquid was boiled, cooled, and left to ferment with natural yeasts. There were no thermometers or sterile conditions. The taste varied widely from one batch to the next. In some regions, women known as aloueves sold their surplus brew to neighbors. Their image in folklore became notorious, often mocked in poems and sermons as greedy, dishonest, or sexually immoral. In truth, many aloueves were simply small-scale businesswomen keeping households afloat. While households brewed for themselves, larger brewing became an industry in towns and cities. By the 13th and 14th centuries, professional breweries were operating, staffed by men and women who produced ale on a scale too large for home consumption. Taverns and alehouses grew alongside this trade. The alehouse was the most common, a place where villagers gathered for a mug of cheap drink and gossip. Taverns, by contrast, were often wealthier establishments, associated with wine rather than ale, and connected to trade routes or urban centers. Inside an alehouse, the scene was noisy and cramped. Wooden benches, smoke from the hearth, mugs passed back and forth, and the sound of dice rattling on the table. Men and women alike drank there, though moralists frowned upon women who lingered too long in such spaces. Taverns offered more variety, often serving imported wines and providing meals as well. These became the centers of urban social life, places where merchants struck deals, clerks gathered, and students drank away their stipends. Alcohol was not reserved for evenings or special occasions. It was consumed steadily throughout the day. A laborer might begin with a mug of small ale at breakfast, drink more at midday to quench thirst in the fields, and finish with stronger drink in the evening. Children, too, drank weak ale, which was considered safer than water. The amount consumed could be astonishing. Records from monasteries suggest allowances of up to a gallon of ale per monk per day. Not all of it was strong, of course, but even weak ale carried alcohol. The steady presence of drink shaped the rhythms of life, work, rest, prayer, and celebration alike. With constant drinking came constant warnings. Medieval sermons and moral tracts often railed against drunkenness. It was not merely a sin of indulgence but a threat to order. Drunkenness could lead to fights, wasted labor, or shameful behavior. Songs and stories from the time reveal both humor and anxiety about excessive drink. The character of the drunken peasant or the bumbling alewife appears frequently, used as both comic relief and moral lesson. In towns, laws restricted taverns from staying open too late or from selling ale of poor quality. Ale tasters were appointed to check the strength and purity of drink, though corruption was common. For students, soldiers, and sailors, drunkenness was almost expected. University towns in particular gained reputations for riotous drinking. One chronicler of Oxford complained that students spent more time in taverns than in lectures. Wine brought its own dangers. Stronger than ale, and often mixed with spices or sweeteners, it could be both medicine and poison. Nobles drank heavily at feasts, often consuming multiple cups per course. The richness of the drink, combined with heavy food, led to chronic ailments such as gout. Yet wine retained its status as a drink of refinement. To refuse wine at a lord's table was nearly unthinkable, even if one's stomach already churned with excess. Wine was tied to religion as well, central to the ritual of the Eucharist, giving it a spiritual weight that ale could not match. To catch the mood of medieval drinking, you need only listen to the songs that were sung in taverns and at feasts. Many were rowdy, celebrating ale and wine as gifts from God or mocking those who could not hold their drink. Others were moralizing, reminding listeners of the dangers of excess. The Carmina Burana, a famous medieval manuscript of poetry and song, includes numerous verses about the pleasures and perils of alcohol. Imagine the scene: a group of clerks in a tavern, cups of wine before them, pounding the table as they chant a Latin drinking song. Outside, townspeople pass in the narrow street. Inside, the air is thick with smoke, spilled drink, and laughter. Looking at medieval drinking culture, one sees a paradox. Alcohol was essential to survival, a daily source of calories and hydration. Yet it was also feared, regulated, and moralized against. It was both food and vice, sustenance and temptation. The tavern could be a place of fellowship, where friendships were sealed over mugs of ale. It could also be a place of ruin, where fortunes were lost to gambling, reputations destroyed in drunken brawls, and families left hungry because wages were spent on drink. As you picture yourself in the dim light of an alehouse, your mug nearly empty, the dice rattling at the next table, you may wonder, did medieval people drink for pleasure, or was it simply the least dangerous option in a world where even water could not be trusted? By now, you have seen how medieval people brewed their ale, imported their wines, and gathered in alehouses and taverns. You have tasted, in imagination, the sour and cloudy drinks that sustained them, and you have heard the warnings against drunkenness. But what do these drinks tell us about the deeper currents of medieval life? To finish this story, we will look at three overlapping themes: how alcohol functioned symbolically, how it was used as medicine, and how its cultural role shaped the centuries that followed. To sit at a medieval table was to do more than quench thirst. Every sip carried meaning. At a feast, wine marked status. It was the drink of refinement, associated with nobility, learning, and the sacred. To pour wine for a guest was a gesture of honor. To water down wine too much, or to serve a sour batch to someone of rank, was an insult. Even the vessel mattered. A lord might drink from a silver goblet, while peasants used wooden cups. Ale, meanwhile, was the drink of common folk. It symbolized everyday survival, the warmth of home, the rhythm of labor. Yet it was not without symbolic power. In villages, sharing a mug of ale was a gesture of trust and fellowship. Alehouses became places where disputes were settled, friendships confirmed, and news spread. Religious symbolism also infused drink. Wine in the Eucharist was believed to become the blood of Christ. Monks brewed ale not only for themselves but as an act of charity for travelers and the poor. Drinking together could be an act of community, mirroring spiritual fellowship. Medieval people did not separate food, drink, and medicine the way we do today. Every beverage was understood in terms of its effect on the body's humors. Wine was considered warming and drying, useful for balancing cold, damp conditions. Physicians recommended spiced wines for stomach complaints, diluted wines for fever, and strong red wines for weakness. The quality of wine mattered. Too sour, and it could upset the stomach; too sweet, and it could clog the body with phlegm. Ale was more ambiguous. It was nourishing, but heavy. Weak ale was thought to be healthy for children and laborers, providing energy without upsetting the balance of humors. Stronger alesh were considered less wholesome, especially when overindulged. Herbal infusions were often added to drinks for medicinal effect. Wormwood might be steeped in wine as a digestive aid. Rosemary ale was believed to sharpen the mind. Even honeyed mead, when rare, was praised as restorative. In monasteries, the medicinal role of drink was taken seriously. Monks compiled recipes for spiced wines, herbal beers, and other tonics, recording their supposed effects in careful detail. These were not indulgences, but attempts at healing. Yet even with these medicinal theories, medieval people knew well that alcohol could cause harm. Excessive drinking led to gout among nobles, wasted wages among peasants, and disorder in towns. Chroniclers recorded tales of bishops who drank themselves into disgrace, of kings who embarrassed themselves at feasts, and of students who rioted in taverns. The dangers of drink became moral lessons. Drunkenness was equated with sin, loss of self-control, and shame. Yet society itself depended so heavily on fermented beverages that the line between necessity and vice was blurred. To condemn drink entirely was impossible. To control it became the challenge. The medieval world left a legacy of drink that still lingers today. Ale evolved into hopped beer, first in parts of Germany and the Low Countries in the late Middle Ages, before spreading across Europe. Wine culture became increasingly refined, with vineyards, vintages, and regional pride. The tavern remained central to social life, eventually evolving into the public house and café cultures we know today. Even our anxieties about alcohol, its pleasures, its dangers, its role in social life, can be traced back to medieval sermons, laws, and customs. To drink in moderation was praised, to drink in excess was condemned. These ideas remain familiar centuries later. Imagine, then, the medieval drinker, a peasant lifting a mug of cloudy ale after a day in the fields, a monk sipping spiced wine in the cloister, a noble raising a silver cup at a feast, a group of students shouting drinking songs in a smoky tavern. Each is doing more than drinking. Each is participating in a world where every sip was bound up with survival, status, belief, and community. The taste may have been sour, the ale warm, the wine spoiled, but the act itself was charged with meaning. And so we end with a thought: in a world where water itself was suspect, did medieval people learn to love the strange taste of their drinks, or did they simply accept them as symbols of a life where safety, fellowship, and survival mattered more than flavor? When you imagine a medieval feast, perhaps you see a great hall filled with lords and ladies, their tables heavy with roasted meats, pies, and gilded dishes. But behind that splendor, out of sight, there was another world entirely: the kitchens. To enter that space was to step into the true heart of the feast, a place of fire, smoke, noise, and sweat, where dozens of workers labored endlessly so that others might dine in comfort. Medieval kitchens varied according to wealth and region, but in the halls of the nobility, they were vast, separate buildings, set apart from the main hall to reduce the risk of fire. The kitchens of great castles such as Durham, Winchester, or Hampton Court could rival small houses in size, with high ceilings to vent smoke, enormous hearths, and storage chambers for meat, grain, and spices. The space was divided into specialized areas. One hearth might be devoted to roasting meats on turning spits, while another simmered soups in cauldrons. There were side rooms for baking, brewing, and even for preparing sauces. In some places, a separate pastry kitchen was necessary, since the craft of pie-making required its own ovens and expertise. At the center of it all was the master cook, a figure of authority who directed the chaos much like a conductor leading an orchestra. Beneath him were assistants, spit-turners, potboys, scullions, bakers, brewers, and countless others. Each role was small, but together, they made the feast possible. For the lowest servants, life in the kitchen was exhausting and thankless. Boys known as turnbroches spent hours standing before the fire, slowly rotating spits heavy with roasting meat. The heat was intense, the smoke suffocating, and burns were common. Many turnbroches were children, some even bought or taken from poor families to serve in this role, since it required little training but great endurance. Scullions scrubbed pots, often with sand or ashes, scraping away the grease left behind by boiling and frying. Water for washing had to be hauled by hand, often heated in separate cauldrons. Their hands were cracked, their backs bent, and their labor invisible to the diners who enjoyed the results. Other servants carried food between the kitchen and the hall, a task that might involve navigating muddy courtyards, stone passages, or icy staircases while balancing heavy platters. Mistakes were punished harshly. A dropped dish meant wasted food, wasted labor, and sometimes a beating. At the higher level were the trained cooks. Unlike scullions or spitboys, cooks were valued for their skills, often receiving higher wages and sometimes traveling between noble households for employment. A good cook could season dishes well, use spices economically, and understand the complex recipes of aristocratic dining. Cookbooks of the late Middle Ages, such as Le Viandier or the Famille of Curry, reveal the elaborate expectations placed on cooks. Recipes called for sauces thickened with almonds, meats glazed with saffron, or pies filled with layers of meat, fruit, and spices. Cooks were also expected to make food visually impressive, using food coloring, sugar sculptures, and even the reassembly of animals into dramatic displays. This was art as well as sustenance, and the cooks were artists, though they themselves rarely shared in the feast they created. Their role was to serve, not to taste. To stand in a medieval kitchen was to be surrounded by overwhelming sensation. Fires roared, spits creaked, cauldrons bubbled. The air was thick with the smell of roasting beef, onions, herbs, and smoke. Dogs sometimes lingered at the edges, hoping for scraps, while servants shouted over the noise to coordinate their tasks. There was no silence, no calm. The kitchen was as busy as a battlefield, time to ensure that dozens of dishes reached the table at the proper moment, hot and ready to impress. For great feasts, the pressure was immense, hundreds of guests might be waiting, and a delay could embarrass a lord before his peers. Not every day was a feast, but the kitchens were never still. Daily meals still required bread, ale, pottage, and occasionally meat or fish. Servants rose early, often before dawn, to stoke fires and begin preparations. Bread had to be baked in advance, grains ground and boiled, vegetables chopped. Brewing ale was nearly constant, since fresh batches were needed every few days. During Lent and other fasting periods, the kitchens shifted to fish, vegetables, and dairy substitutes like almond milk. These too required planning and effort, often more so than meat. Thus, even in times of restraint, the labor of servants never ceased. Without these servants, the scullions, turnbroches, cooks, carriers, bakers, and brewers, the noble feast could not exist. The glittering displays of roasted peacocks or gilded pies were built on their sweat, their burns, and their endless, unthanked labor. And yet, they remained invisible. Chronicles of great feasts praised the hosts and their guests but rarely named the workers who made it possible. Their world was one of toil without recognition, and their stories have largely been forgotten. As you imagine the grand medieval feast, pause for a moment in the smoky kitchens, where a child turns a spit until his arms ache, where a scullion scrubs until her fingers bleed, and where a cook balances spices as carefully as a scribe balances ink. The feast in the hall may glitter, but it is here, in the kitchen, that the true weight of labor lies. And so we ask, if the medieval feast is remembered as a symbol of power and wealth, why have the hands that made it possible been so easily erased from memory? When you picture a medieval feast, your eye is naturally drawn to the head table, the lord, his family, perhaps visiting dignitaries, all seated at a raised dais. They ate the finest dishes, drank the best wine, and enjoyed the spectacle of entertainment, but a feast was not only a reflection of the host's wealth, it was also a mirror of the social order. The arrangement of the hall, the seating of the guests, and even the division of servants' duties reinforced who mattered most and who mattered least. The feast was, in every sense, a performance of hierarchy. The phrase, sitting above the salt, still lingers in our language today, but in the medieval feast, it was a literal practice. On the high table, usually positioned at the top of the hall, a large and ornate salt cellar was placed as a symbol of wealth and importance. Those who sat above it, the lords, honored guests, and high-ranking clergy, were of sufficient rank to be counted among the elite. Below the salt, seated at long trestle tables stretching down the hall, were those of lesser status, minor retainers, servants of middling rank, visiting merchants, or anyone else deemed unworthy of proximity to the Lord's table. The food served to them was often plainer, sometimes even cold by the time it arrived. The lowest servants, the scullions, kitchen boys, and menials, rarely sat in the hall at all. They ate later, sometimes after the feast had ended, consuming whatever remained. This system reinforced not just class but also the visibility of power, who was allowed to be seen dining in grandeur, and who was relegated to the shadows. Each servant in the feast had a precise role, and stepping outside of it could be dangerous. The steward, often a man of significant authority, oversaw the entire operation. Beneath him, the marshal arranged the seating, the butler managed the wine and ale, and the pantler controlled the bread. These were not merely jobs, they were positions of trust. Bread and drink were essential, and to mishandle them was to dishonor the host. Then there were the carvers, trained to slice meat with elegance before presenting it to the table. Carving was considered an art, taught through manuals that described exactly how to hold the knife, how to portion the meat, and even to gesture gracefully while serving. It was a performance of respect as much as a practical act. Lower still were the cupbearers, who served wine while also ensuring it had not been poisoned, a task that carried both danger and responsibility. Beneath them came endless ranks of general servants, carrying dishes, clearing tables, and responding to the needs of those above them. The lowest tier, often overlooked, were the kitchen staff who never entered the hall at all. They remained behind the scenes, working long after the last guest had left, ensuring that the feast's debris was cleaned, scraps were sorted, and fires were banked for the night. For many servants, life was lived in permanent dependence on their lord. Wages were often meager or non-existent. Instead, servants were compensated with food, clothing, and the relative security of belonging to a household. In an uncertain medieval world of famine, plague, and war, this was not insignificant. To eat daily, even from scraps, was a kind of survival strategy. But it was also a form of bondage. Servants had little freedom, and their lives were shaped by the rhythms of their master's household. They could be dismissed without notice, beaten for mistakes, or relocated when the Lord traveled. Their loyalty was expected, and their individuality was invisible. Young boys and girls were often placed into service by their parents, who hoped the household of a noble might provide training, opportunity, or at the very least, sustenance. Some rose through the ranks, becoming trusted stewards or skilled cooks, but many remained at the lowest level for life. It is important to remember that every aspect of the feast, from the food to the seating to the service, was a demonstration of the host's authority. To feed hundreds of guests was to prove that one had the wealth, land, and resources to command such abundance. But the spectacle was not for guests alone. Servants, too, absorbed the display. Their labor in preparing, serving, and cleaning was part of the machinery of power, reminding them of their place in the grand design. The hall was a stage, and everyone, from lord to scullion, played a part. One of the most revealing aspects of feasts was the treatment of leftovers. Meat and bread were rarely wasted. Instead, they were distributed according to rank. High-ranking servants and favored retainers received better portions, while lower servants and the poor might be given bones, broth, or crusts. In some households, almsgiving was formalized. Leftovers were sent out to beggars at the gate, both as charity and as a performance of piety. But for many servants, scraps were simply survival. They learned to make do with what was left, boiling bones into soup, collecting crumbs of bread, or saving bits of fat for cooking. Thus, even in waste, the hierarchy of the feast persisted. Though the life of service was harsh, it did provide a kind of stability. For some, it was preferable to life as a wandering laborer or a starving peasant. The feast, even if only glimpsed from the edge of the hall, was a reminder that food existed in abundance somewhere, even if one only touched it second-hand. Some servants even took pride in their roles, especially those of skill, the carver who sliced meat elegantly, the butler who poured wine with grace, the cook who mastered the art of spice. To serve well was a path, however narrow, to respect within the household, and perhaps even upward mobility. When we look at the medieval feast, it is easy to see only the glittering tables and the nobles above the salt. Yet, the feast was sustained by countless lives below it, the invisible laborers whose survival depended on scraps, whose status was reinforced by their distance from the Lord, and whose existence rarely entered the written record. And so we must ask, if the medieval feast was a grand theater of wealth, how many stories were lost in the shadows behind its stage? When the last goblet was drained and the final song played, the great hall of a medieval lord fell into an entirely different rhythm. For the nobles, the end of the feast meant retreat, to chambers warmed with tapestries, to softer beds, or to private conversation behind closed doors. For the servants, however, the true labor was only beginning. The aftermath of a medieval feast was a long and wearying process, stretching deep into the night and, often, into the next day. The feast was not finished until the hall was restored, the kitchens cleaned, and the scraps accounted for. What lingers for us now, as we peer back into history, is less the glamour of the banquet than the dull persistence of this invisible work. The first task was clearing the hall itself. Trestle tables, which could be assembled and taken down quickly, were dismantled and carried away. Benches were stacked against walls. Platters, trenchers, goblets, and knives were collected, often in chaotic heaps. By torchlight or candlelight, servants worked their way down the hall, collecting scraps of bread and meat that had fallen to the floor, sweeping up rushes littered with bones and spilled drink, and attempting to restore a semblance of order. The higher-ranking guests had already departed, but their presence lingered in the disorder of the hall. Servants hurried, for any delay could bring reprimand. The lord and his family might still pass through, and it was unthinkable to leave the space in disarray. Meanwhile, the kitchens remained alive with activity long after the feast's end. Cauldrons had to be emptied, pots scrubbed, and spits cleaned. Grease coated nearly every surface, and cleaning it was laborious, involving hot water carried in heavy buckets and sand used as an abrasive. The scullions, the lowest of the low, bore the brunt of this work. Their hands were raw from scrubbing, their clothes perpetually stained with fat and soot. Some servants were tasked with sorting what remained. Bones were collected for boiling into broth the next day. Fat and drippings were stored for use in cooking or making candles. Bread crusts were dried and saved, sometimes to be ground into crumbs for thickening stews. In this way, nothing was wasted, but nothing was glamorous either. The heat of the fires, which had raged all day to roast meat and boil stews, still radiated long into the night, making the kitchens unbearably hot. Yet fires had to be carefully tended, sometimes even kept alive until morning, for relighting them was no small task. That it was only after the hall was cleared and the kitchen scrubbed that the lowest servants could finally sit to eat. Their meals, drawn from what was left behind, were humble affairs. Cold meat, broken bread, watered ale, these were the rewards of hours of labor. Yet for many, it was still more food than they might otherwise have seen in a day. There was a rhythm to this survival. feast nights meant hard labor but also the chance of scraps more plentiful than usual. Servants learned to anticipate these moments, even if they came with exhaustion. Some scraps were even smuggled away. A kitchen boy might hide a bone or a piece of bread to take home to his family, though discovery could bring punishment. Others bartered with scraps, trading bits of fat or ale for favors among themselves. The feast's abundance trickled downward, and though it never reached equality, it shaped a shadow economy within the household. As the night stretched on, the great hall grew quiet. The torches dimmed, the echoes of laughter faded, and only the shuffle of weary feet remained. Some servants slept in corners of the kitchen or hall, too tired to return to their own quarters. Others stole moments of rest before dawn brought new duties. The feast, for the nobles, had been a spectacle of power and abundance. For the servants, it was simply another night of endless labor. The next morning, the lord might order a hunt, or travelers might arrive requiring hospitality, and the cycle would begin again. There was little rest in service. What became of these servants in the long run? For some, life in service stretched from childhood into old age. A kitchen boy might become a cook, a servant girl a laundress, a cupbearer a trusted household officer. Others never advanced, spending their entire lives in the drudgery of labor, largely invisible to history. When famine struck, servants in great households fared better than peasants in the fields, for they had direct access to food, though always in lesser measure. In times of plague, however, their close quarters and constant exposure to waste and sickness made them vulnerable. Many died unnamed, their lives recorded only in the margins of household accounts. Yet survival itself was a kind of achievement. To endure through long hours, meager rewards, and uncertain futures was its own quiet form of resilience. It is tempting, in thinking about medieval feasts, to linger on the image of abundance, roasted meats, golden goblets, songs, and laughter. But if we shift our gaze just slightly, we see another truth, that the feast depended entirely on invisible hands. Without servants to scrub pots, stoke fires, carry platters, and clear refuse, the spectacle would have been impossible. Their labor was not remembered in poetry or chronicled in noble records, but it was the foundation upon which every banquet rested. The hierarchy of the feast was built not only on who sat above or below the salt but also on who stood in the shadows, making sure the food appeared on the table at all. As the candles guttered and the last servant laid down to sleep on the hard floor of the kitchen, the great feast was over. By morning, only the faint smell of grease and the ash of dying fires would remain. The hall would look empty, its glory already fading into memory. And so we are left with a question: when history remembers the lords who feasted, should we not also remember the countless, nameless servants who ensured that the feast could take place at all?